Okay, before I forget, God is infinite enough to have all that information, right? To have completed the distance between zero and infinity, or even, zero and one, etc. So if God, let's say we have enough faith to say that God does exist and God does enact that labor, that we are actually, in fact, in the process of doing that, then I can play my finite part in that infinite game of gathering information about things and making that information as accurate a reflection of the thing that I'm trying to reflect as possible. So that I'm basically trying to create a carbon copy of everything that already exists and make another digital holographic copy of it. The reason for that being that that level of resolution at the relativistic scale, which is the simplest, just beyond the zeroth, gives us a limit of perfection. So we could theoretically achieve a small, truncated version of that and then grow it. So we could have enough information about something that no person could, if they're rational and willing, miss the mark and get the wrong prediction. That we could build a system that is so logically integrated and precise, having first presumed, of course, the central axioms that make it function, because it always assumes something. But having made those assumptions, and if those assumptions are true, then all the stuff that we make inside that theoretical framework is also true and must be necessarily true, because there are no gaps and there are no logical fallacies inside that space. That then gives us the proper lens by which we can then discern our subjective states, at which point we can begin accumulating information about our subjectivity at the zeroth dimension, which is the most fundamental field that we could possibly get to, expand that and become as artistic as possible, which would then, like I said, lead to, hopefully, the transcendence beyond art into God. And at that point, I think that's when we have achieved as deep a perfection as we can. We can also go in the opposite direction and go from relativity into objectivity and talk about pure geometrical form, the Platonic world of ideal forms. Then moving from that, we could talk about the physical world, empirical, spatial reality, without the time, just snapshots of space, spatial arrangements, and empirical events. And then beyond that, then we can talk about time as well and extend that empiricism into the real world as we experience it in the fourth dimension. And then we can go even further into choices, into totalities of choices, into the relations between the totalities of choices, and etc. So you could go for infinity that way too. And that's another route to take. It's not all about the art and then God. There is also the other side too. But I think that it's more exciting, at least for me, to think about transcendence toward God versus toward reality. But, like I said, I think all three of those paths are all equally and simultaneously important. So it is important equally to know about reality as it is to know about God, because how do we know what to do if we have the information? Great, we learned about what God's will is, but we have no idea how to actually manifest that into physical reality, because we're just a bunch of theoreticians and logicians and philosophers who have never picked up a hammer in our lives, and we have no idea how to use it. So, it does require all of it equally, so that we don't move in any direction too far off so that we become imbalanced. Because if we do get too close to God and too far away from reality, then we become delusional, we become zealotrous, we become intolerant of other people's faiths, etc. If we get too far away and we're not as close to God anymore, then we become purposeless and nihilistic, and it just nothing really seems to matter anymore. And it's just too hard. It makes too much sense, and it's too logical. And, there's not enough change. There's not enough dynamism. Because like I said, as you approach infinity, you get less dynamic. As you approach zero, you get more dynamic. So if you get closer to God, you become so dynamic that you start shaking at the fucking core and you shatter and you can't go any further. And if you get too far away, you become so solid, so frozen that you can't even move anymore. And you get stuck in that kind of nightmare. So there's not one that's better or worse than the other. They're equally bad to get too far off course, to get too far off on one than the other. So there does have to be a balance. But it's interesting to note those. And I think the value of what I'm doing is I'm trying to get something that's simple enough that everybody can transmit this, because it's the field of relativity itself. And that way, aliens, humans, robots, AI, everybody can agree on everything, because the theory is relativity. It's an attempt at describing relativity itself. So if every part of relativity is correctly explained and accurate, then all of our predictions will be logically valid, at least. They won't necessarily be true. They won't necessarily be real, but they are necessarily logically valid inside the assumptive framework that I've chosen for it, which is what I think is going to give it its own character. There will be other paradigms that do the same job that mine does, but they have different central axioms. They have different assumptions, and those frameworks then generate a totally different image, but it will have a lot, I would hope, of convergence, a lot of agreement, a lot of alignment, a lot of mutual affirmation. I'm hoping. It would be a bad thing if there was just this one theory that I've got, and then it's not related to anything else. It's just isolated, and therefore I would consider it to be pretty wrong. If it can't integrate with anything else, then it's wrong. It doesn't fit. It doesn't apply. You know what I mean? So I really hope in the future that other people, when they come up with their paradigmatic structures, having made their central axioms, assumptions, and their specific framework, looking at the same field of relativity will generate a slightly different image, but it will be similar enough that it's translatable, where you can recognize the same general features, but the specifics of it will be vastly different. And that's what's going to give them their own personalities or their own character. And where was I going with this? So the purpose of what I'm doing with this theory is to describe as many things as I can think of in a logically valid way that anybody could understand it, so that there's a complete cognitive map of everything that exists. If that framework is revealed, it's, yes, admittedly one of an infinite number of others, but it's functional. It does work. Yes, it has its own quirks, but it is functional, and it does accurately describe most of the stuff that I've come across. There are things that are wrong with it. Of course, there's always wrong things with everything. But those wrong things have become so minimized that the vast majority of the theory is accurate, functional, and promising. And I've made predictions with it that have come true, and that's good enough for me. In the future, I will formalize this and make it a lot more specific, especially about non-zero limits, about smudginess. That is so huge, because people have this tendency of thinking of things in infinite resolution, where it's like a cup is a cup, man, and you can see the edge. Yeah, but if you zoom in on that edge, then it gets fuzzy, because there's so many of these ridges that you don't see with your naked eye. But if you were to zoom in on a microscope and you were to see the paper, there's ridges in it, and it's got waves and crescents and troughs, and it's a landscape. You know, it's got hills and valleys and all kinds of things. It's not smooth. It's not infinitely smooth. There are no infinitely smooth edges. All the edges that we've come across are all fractal. They're rough. They have a landscape to them. They have a character to them. So there's no theory that's ever going to encapsulate everything perfectly every time, but we can always approximate that to a greater resolution. So that's the purpose of this, is to increase our resolution, increase our precision. And we need it because we're about to enter the singularity, about which there's going to be this AGI unit that we build, and its intelligence is going to be indistinguishable from ours. And then we're going to have to start talking about freedom of will and ethics and fears about it taking over, and our own obsolescence as humanity given these particular functions. And should we merge with it and hybridize and become cyborgs, or should we die on the reservation? And everything else, or whatever. All of those things are going to require a lot of precision. And we need the precision so that we can tell the difference between a cyborg and a human, or between a robot and an AGI, etc. We're going to need the precision necessary to discern the differences between these things, because those are going to be very different functional creatures, where you can't interchange them. Even though they're very similar, you can't interchange them. So precision is necessary there. Also, it will help us with everything else, so that we can hopefully end wars. And, if we're going to have those conflicts where we can't debate them away with logic, and that's 99% of all the conflicts, they can all be reduced in logic to something that is just illogical. Somebody made a boo-boo, somebody had a typo, whatever the fuck happened, accidents happen, something happened. You can logically isolate that cause, and you can then determine what the results of that will be 99% of the time. Sometimes there's going to be these really weird situations that you can't reduce logically, and there's no logical resolution to them. The only way then is to fight. Well, you could fight in a simulation, ethically, civilly, like a civilized person. Have a war game, and you have robots versus robots, and they're all, you could either, and there's so many rules that you could do. You could have, okay, for every actual soldier that you do have, which would be kept in emergencies because sometimes people cheat, for every one of those, you can have an equal image of that, an equal simulated avatar of that. And you have to have each soldier manning one avatar in their video game. They have one life. You don't get an infinite number of lives, you get one life. And if you die, if you step on a landmine and you're dead, that's it. You're dead for the rest of the game. You don't come back in. Stuff like that. And then you do that in a simulated virtual reality. You do that over literally a video game, and one country versus another country. And you could even do multiple countries. You could do multiple teams. But the only rule is that it's as close to reality as you can make it, and therefore it's 1 for 1. You've got one soldier, you get one soldier avatar. You've got one helicopter, you get one helicopter avatar. You've got one torpedo, you've got one torpedo avatar. Everything is equal. Then you run that simulation in real time against each other in a shared virtual environment. Whoever then wins, then that becomes actualized peaceably. So in the real world will then reflect exactly what happens in that virtual reality after the fact, with no bloodshed and no violence, no unexpected events happen. Everybody knows that there's a certain grace period timeline. You've got 3 years to make these changes. And those changes are objectively measurable, and they can be done, like I said, in any given timeline. You could give them 20 years. You could give them 100. You could give them 1. You could give them instant. Do it as it's happening. You could do whatever you want there, but you can make any of those changes to the physical world to match the virtual world without any bloodshed, just because it happened in this conflict, and that's how they decided that they wanted to do it. Now, if someone does cheat, then you've got your background army, your actual real army, to defend you. And that's what that does. It acts as an emergency in case somebody decides to cheat and they want to be a sore loser, and they're like, well, no, it's because the video game connection was bad. And so, and my thumb hurt today, and I couldn't make fast judgments, and it was so unfair. And so, fuck you, I'm going to go rogue. I'm going to do it in reality. And that's why everybody has their own actual army to begin with. So the two will always go together. So that way we can still have the wars, but nobody dies. And If somebody dies in the video game, right, they don't actually die in real life. You don't have to get rid of the soldiers at the end. You could punish the loser and say, well, you started this conflict, so we're going to take your soldiers away. I think that's a bit harsh, but you could. I would make it, if it were me, where at the end of it, the only thing that changes are the boundary lines between the countries. And that's the only thing that you can really contest and say, I want more room or whatever. Because everything else that you're going to say, that all gets dictated by jurisprudence, which is dictated by those geographic lines. The only way then that we can have any contest as to who is legitimately in power is at those lines. And then we can change those lines and we can say they're bigger or smaller, but we can't say what's true within them. Within them, the country that is sovereign has the right to make whatever law it wants. At the limit of that country, at its border, that's the contest. Who should be in charge there? Because it's equally in between one and another country. So that is contestable. So you can have wars over that. So you can have wars that then result in the changing of those legal lines. So you can say, my country actually expanded during this war because we were able to fight off everybody, etc., using this video game. I know that sounds silly, but that's equivalent to saying, I have bigger borders because I was able to conquer the neighboring people with my army. It's exactly as silly and arbitrary as saying that you won it in a video game. It's identical. The only difference is one of them makes more sense because it's peaceable and nonviolent, and the other one makes less sense because it's not. So, these are different things that can be used, that can be products of what I'm trying to do with my theory. So it has lots of applications, and I think that's one of the major ones that I really like. But these changes are all about, what takes precedence. So if we're going to try to figure out, okay, I am an infinitely malleable person and I can make any choices that I wish. Like those war games, what choices should I make? Well, that depends on which territory that you like to occupy. If you like to go to one country and have this set of rules, then you're that kind of person. If you like to go over here and have these set of rules, then you're this kind of person. And so we can measure that and say that that's true, but that's only true of the avatar, because the person behind that avatar is still making the choices. So the person behind the avatar is not actually reducible to that, because they can change, they can leave. They might be in China today, but they could be in Japan tomorrow. They could be in New Zealand next week. We don't know where they're going to go. So we don't have any idea about who that person is. We just know where they're at any given moment. And that's their avatar. But the person behind that avatar is infinitely complex. They can do whatever. They can go wherever they want. They're not restricted to those countries. But a person that is in China, we're treating them as Chinese because they're within the jurisprudence of China. So ostensibly they chose to be there, so then they're Chinese. Now, that's not all they are, though, because they could move from China to Japan, at which point they would become Japanese. So who is that person? Is that person Japanese or Chinese? Is it a ratio between the two? And this is what I was saying about, like, when you zoom in into the 0th dimension, it gets very dynamic, and it's almost impossible to tell the difference between one thing and another. So we have these ratios and we have these amalgamations, but we know that the person that exists is beyond those, because the person is actually changing those when they change from China to Japan. That changes the ratio of how Chinese versus how Japanese that they are. So when they choose to make that choice, that's going to determine how much of a ratio there ends up being at the end of their life. How much of their life did they spend in China versus Japan? Well, that's not static. That changes depending on what the person chooses during their life. If they choose to go to Japan or not, or if they even can, maybe they're not even able to because of something. And what did they do about that? And those are all choices. So they're beyond China and Japan. They're beyond the avatar of being Chinese versus being Japanese, or even the ratio in between. It's beyond all that. And because it's beyond all that, then you have to ask the question, then who is that person? Because now I can't call them either Japanese or Chinese, or even a ratio of Chinese to Japanese. I have to say that they're someone who chooses all that stuff. But who is that? because I can't tell who that is based off the choices, because the choices, like I said, are limited. They're limited to this world. Given a different world, they would have made different choices. So then I don't know who that person is based off their choices. So then their choices aren't a good measure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, that is what makes us like God. Because like God, no matter how many of these measures that we apply, we can never say for certain who that person actually is, or why they really did that, or if they are even to blame for that or not. So it confounds me when I look at that, and then I realize this is what I'm experiencing is the limits of relativity, because it's like I'm trying to turn a relation into a subject. I'm trying to turn information into a person. I'm trying to turn my worldview into the world, and they're not the same thing. And so, of course, there's going to be this mismatch, and it shouldn't surprise me. But it intuitively, it does. It seems off. It's jarring. It's like, what the hell is this? Who am I? Do I even exist? I'm not my choices. I'm not where I live. I'm not my skin color. I'm not my weight. I'm not my eye color. I'm not what I choose. I'm not what I don't choose. I'm not anything. What the hell am I? So, yes, ultimately, I think people are infinitely malleable given certain conditions. And I think it's the conditions that end up determining who we are as finite people. Because let's say I had all those butterfly effect variant worlds, right? He has his full journal, and we can go through the movie and we can say, okay, there's this variant, there's that variant, and we can count them. And we can say, this is the whole world that he lives in. Regardless of what he chooses, these are all the possibilities that he could be, these people. And I could combine all that, and I could say, that's Evan. That's that guy, It is the one who could choose all these. But then I could take that, and I could say, what about his parents' decisions? And then I could say, what about his friends' decisions? What kind of variance does Evan turn into in their worlds? Because they change depending on his worlds and his choices. He changes depending on their choices too. See, so you put all that together, if that's even possible, and then say, okay, that must then be Evan. Nope, still not it. Because as you go further and further and further, you realize that the number of Evans approaches infinity. And there's so many of these Evans all running around, all doing different shit. Some of them are preppy, some of them are gothic, some of them are punk. They've got all their different personalities, all their different choices, all their different lifelines. And then you're like, but these people have almost nothing in common. How could these all be the same person? Do we even learn anything about this specific person by looking at this vast diversity of all these different characters? So, this is the point that the postmodernists are coming up with in the culture nowadays, is this question. Aren't people infinitely malleable? Is there really anything that I can call myself that is endemic to me that no one else has, other than my location at this point in space and time? Is that what I really am? Am I just a location? Can I even make a choice, or am I just passively discerning the experience of some deterministic particle as it randomly floats through existence? It's a very strange thing to try to question. And so what I think it is that, like everything, it's a spectrum, it's a smudge, and the smudginess of it is in the contest or the tension between the dynamism of the zeroth dimension. Like I said, I could be anyone. I could choose so many of these different choices that the people that I would turn into are totally different people. But I'm even greater than those because I'm the one that makes those choices. So that's dynamism. On the other end of the spectrum, then there's the actual variance that I am, of which there's an infinitude. Like I said, had I made any of these other choices, I would have turned into all those other people. So all those other people then constitute some part of my being, and those are the static parts. That's the part that gives me the resolution that says, okay, now I can see I am this. But again, Not quite. There's still that one infinitesimal part of me that doesn't get encapsulated in any of the variants. And it's the one that chooses which of those variants got to be.